Hello, friend. Whether you have been sitting here with me for years, or you just wandered in for the very first time, it is so good to have you. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, pull the blanket up a little higher, and let the room go completely quiet. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time, not to a battlefield, not a throne room, but somewhere far more intimate. We are stepping into ancient bedchambers to explore the desperate, dangerous, and utterly bizarre lengths our ancestors went to just to control their own destinies. From toxic heavy metals and exotic animal waste to a miracle plant harvested into absolute extinction. This is a story of quiet defiance and secret herbal knowledge whispered between women in the shadows. And history class never told you any of this. Long before modern medicine could offer a simple prescription, women were already taking survival into their own hands. In the fading light of a late afternoon in the Nile Valley, around the year 1850 BCE, the day's work was settling into a quiet rhythm. The heavy heat of the sun had passed, leaving behind the smell of drying river mud and sun-baked stone. Inside the thick-walled homes, the rhythmic grinding of emmer wheat for the evening bread blended with the steady clatter of wooden looms where women sat weaving raw flax into fine linen. Among these ordinary domestic rhythms, other tasks were being carefully attended to. Tasks that were simply another part of managing a household, a body, and a life. We know about these quiet preparations because they were recorded, preserved in the dry, still air of the desert for nearly 4,000 years. The Cahoon Gynecological Papyrus is a fragile, fragmented document written in careful, flowing hieratic script using black and red ink. When unrolled, its dried reed fibers crackle softly, revealing dozens of columns of text that detail the everyday medical routines of Egyptian women. It does not speak of gods or grand moral philosophies, but of fertility, childbirth, and the specific methods used to prevent a pregnancy before it could begin. It is a deeply practical text, treating the management of the reproductive system with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use for tending a crop of barley or preserving fish for the winter months. One of the most common preparations described in this ancient text required the gathering of acacia. A woman would take the sharp thorns, leaves, and tips of the acacia shrub, a plant that grew wild and hardy along the arid edges of the desert, and grind them down into a fine, pale powder using a heavy stone mortar. This crushed plant matter was then folded into raw, heavy honey, stirred slowly in a small clay vessel until it formed a thick, sticky paste. The honey acted as a natural physical barrier, dense enough to block the cervix, while its high sugar content served as a preservative that resisted bacterial growth. But the acacia held a deeper, unseen utility. When the sap and thorns of the acacia plant dissolve in moisture, they ferment and naturally produce lactic acid, a chemical compound that is spermicidal. Without knowing the microscopic mechanics of what they were doing, these women were mixing a remarkably effective chemical contraceptive in the quiet of their own kitchens. To use this preparation, a woman needed a carrier, a simple physical object to hold the sticky, acidic paste exactly where it was needed. She would take a small piece of linen cloth woven from the same local flax that provided the cool, breathable garments she wore every day. The linen would be carefully torn and folded, perhaps twisted into a small, dense wad, and then heavily saturated in the honey and acacia mixture. The soaked cloth was then placed quietly and deeply into the body, seated firmly against the cervix, before a night of rest or intimacy. It was a practical, routine action, carried out in the dim, flickering light of oil lamps, requiring no special ceremony. There was no taboo attached to this careful preparation. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the prevention of pregnancy was not a moral failing or a religious sin, but simply a matter of household management and bodily autonomy. The ingredients were common, gathered from the same markets and muddy riverbanks that supplied their evening meals. The sweet, heavy scent of the raw honey and the earthy, bitter notes of the crushed acacia would have been familiar smells in the home, mingling effortlessly with the aroma of roasted garlic and drying herbs hanging from the wooden rafters. This simple mixture of honey, thorns, and linen represents one of the earliest recorded instances of chemical birth control. It was a formula passed down through generations, taught by mothers to daughters, by midwives to neighbors, long before any scribe set his reed pen to the papyrus in Kahun. As the evening shadows lengthened across the Nile, and the sounds of the village quieted to the occasional bleat of a goat or the soft murmur of conversation, a woman could simply wash her hands and rest, knowing she had taken a measure of control over her own physical future, using nothing more than the plants growing in the dust outside her door. Down by the water's edge, where the Nile sluggishly washed over the thick, dark mud, another resource waited among the reeds. The river was the steady center of all life, providing water for the fields, fish for the evening meal, and a smooth highway for wooden skiffs. But its muddy banks also offered a material that found its way into the deeply private routines of Egyptian women. Here, beneath the relentless, heavy glare of the midday sun, crocodiles would haul their long bodies out of the water to bask on the mudflats. When they eventually slipped back into the cool depths of the river, they left behind their droppings on the sun-baked clay. Gathering this material was simply another chore, folded quietly into the slow rhythms of a typical morning. A woman or a household servant might walk along the dried mud banks, stepping carefully among the tall green stalks of papyrus, looking for these deposits. By the time they were collected, the intense heat of the sun had already baked all the moisture away. The dung was no longer wet or foul, but rather transformed into dry, brittle cakes, bleached pale by the steady light. In this desiccated state, it was essentially odorless, resembling clumps of hard, fibrous earth or dried peat more than anything else. It was gathered up and placed into woven reed baskets, just as one might gather dried brush for a fire or river clay for a new pot. A completely mundane task dictated by the practical needs of the household. Back in the shaded courtyard of a mud brick home, out of the direct heat of the sun, the preparation began. The brittle cakes were emptied into a heavy stone mortar, a tool smoothed by years of daily use. With a rounded stone pestle, a woman would bear down, crushing the baked dung. It would splinter and crack at first, the dried fibers breaking apart under the steady, repetitive rhythm of the stone. Slowly, with patient grinding, it yielded into a fine, pale powder. The texture became soft and chalky, slipping easily between the fingers, leaving a fine dust in the air that was completely divorced from its origins on the riverbank. The rhythmic, scraping sound of stone grinding against stone was a common noise in any Egyptian household, usually associated with milling grain for the daily bread, and this particular task blended seamlessly into the quiet hum of domestic labor. To make this dry, chalky powder useful, it required a binding agent. Women would take a small amount of sour milk, left to sit in a cool clay jug until it had thickened and taken on a sharp, tangy scent. Or perhaps a piece of fermented dough pinched from the day's bread making, and mix it slowly into the dust. As it was worked together by hand, the mixture darkened and became a heavy, malleable paste. This combination was highly deliberate. The fermented dough or sour milk provided a sticky consistency, but it also interacted with the highly alkaline nature of the crocodile dung. Though they did not have the modern vocabulary of pH levels, acidity, or spermicides, the women of the river valleys deeply understood the practical results of their materials. The alkaline dung, combined with the lactic acid of the sour milk, fundamentally altered the internal chemistry of the body, creating a temporary environment where conception was far less likely to occur. Once kneaded to the right consistency, this mixture was shaped by hand into a small, firm pessary. Before it could dry out again, it was inserted deep into the body. The heavy, dense paste functioned quite literally as a physical plug, blocking the passage and providing a thick structural barrier. It was not a glamorous remedy, nor was it entirely comfortable, but it was accessible, relying only on the natural world that surrounded them every day. The recipes for these mixtures were passed down quietly from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, shared in the cool shadows of the house while the bread baked and the linen was spun. It was a deeply grounded approach to the realities of the body, utilizing the mud, the sun, and the creatures of the Nile to carve out a small space of physical security. Far to the west of the Nile, across the vast stretch of the North African coast, lay the Greek city of Cyrene. Here, the landscape shifted from the flat, fertile floodplains of Egypt to dry, scrubby hills sloping down toward the sea. The air carried the salt of the Mediterranean breeze, mixing with the scent of arid earth and the hardy vegetation that clung to the rocky soil. It was in this specific, narrow band of coastal land that a highly prized plant grew wild in the brush. They called it silphium. It was a type of giant fennel, standing tall and thick-stalked against the coastal winds, crowned with wide umbels of yellow flowers that nodded in the sun. The people of Cyrene knew the plant intimately, for their economy eventually came to rest upon its thick, green stems. Harvesting silphium was careful, deliberate work carried out in the heat of the day. Harvesters walked the scrubland hills, searching for mature plants. With sharp, curved blades, they scored the stalks and the fleshy roots, stepping back to let the plant bleed. The sap that oozed from the cuts was pale and milky at first, possessing a sharp, pungent odor that clung to the hands and tunics of the workers. As it sat exposed to the intense North African sun, the sticky resin slowly hardened, turning into a dark, amber-colored gum. Once the resin was fully cured, it was gathered and packed into heavy earthen jars to protect it from moisture and light. These jars were sealed tight and loaded onto wooden merchant vessels waiting in the harbor. The journey across the Mediterranean was slow and subject to the whims of the winds, the ships pitching gently over deep blue waters for weeks at a time. The jars of silphium traveled alongside cargoes of grain, olive oil, and wine. But the hardened sap within them was worth far more by weight. When the ships docked in the bustling ports of Athens or Rome, the jars were hauled into the shaded storehouses of apothecaries. In the quiet, dusty shops of the ancient cities, silphium was unpacked and weighed out on small brass scales. It was an expensive commodity, traded carefully, shaved down into small fragments for the women who came seeking it. The resin was primarily valued as a contraceptive and an abortifacient, taken orally to prevent or end a pregnancy. A small piece of the pungent gum might be dissolved in a cup of wine or rolled into a pill with wool and honey. Women purchased it quietly, relying on its strong, reliable properties to control the size of their families. It was a simple, bitter draught swallowed in the privacy of a bedchamber, leaving behind a sharp, herbal aftertaste. But the dependence on this wild plant carried a slow, inevitable cost. Silphium stubbornly refused to be domesticated. Despite the efforts of Roman botanists and Greek farmers, it would not grow from seed in cultivated fields or carefully tended gardens. It only thrived in the wild, windy hills of Cyrene, in the specific mixture of soil and coastal rain that had always sustained it. As the populations of Rome and Athens grew, so did the demand for the resin. The scrublands were scoured year after year, the plants cut and bled before they could mature and scatter their seeds. The harvest began to dwindle, the jars shipped across the sea becoming fewer and more costly. Eventually, the hills of Cyrene grew bare of the tall, yellow-flowered stalks. By the time of the Roman Empire, silphium had become vanishingly rare, its price astronomical, until finally it was gone altogether. Pliny the Elder recorded that within his lifetime, only a single stalk of genuine silphium was found in Cyrene, plucked and sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Today, the plant exists only in the archaeological record, most notably on the silver coins minted by the city of Cyrene. These ancient coins bear the crisp, stamped image of the silphium plant and its distinct, heart-shaped seed pod. It is a quiet, metallic testament to a plant that was once so woven into daily necessity that an entire city built its wealth upon it, only to watch it fade into the dry earth. With silphium gone, or perhaps simply too expensive for the ordinary household long before it vanished entirely, women turned to materials that were easier to procure. The medical texts of the era reflect this shift toward the practical and the accessible. In the 2nd century, a Greek physician named Soranus, who practiced in Alexandria and Rome, composed a comprehensive text on gynecology. His writings were remarkably clinical and grounded for the time, largely stripping away the layers of magic and superstition that often clouded ancient medicine. He wrote with a calm, methodical detachment, offering practical instructions to women on how to manage their fertility using the everyday wares of the local apothecary. Soranus understood conception in physical, mechanical terms. To prevent it, he reasoned, one simply had to create an environment that would halt or slow the movement of seed. He advised against the use of harsh, corrosive substances that were popular in some circles, warning that they would damage the delicate tissues of the body. Instead, he recommended coating the mouth of the womb with thick, viscous liquids. The goal was to create a stagnant pool, a heavy barrier that would trap the seed before it could progress any further. The foundation of this barrier was often olive oil, but not the bright, peppery first press oil reserved for the dining tables of the wealthy. For this medicinal purpose, a woman would acquire a heavy, low-grade oil. This was the oil pressed from old, bruised olives that had been left to sit yielding a dense, cloudy liquid that was highly acidic and thick with sediment. It was cheap, abundant, and naturally possessed the sluggish viscosity that Serranus deemed necessary for the task. To increase the thickness and effectiveness of the oil, it was blended with tree resins. A common addition was the sap of the cedar tree. In the back rooms of apothecaries, or perhaps in the kitchens of the women themselves, the heavy olive oil would be gently warmed over a low charcoal brazier. Into this warm oil, pieces of golden, sticky cedar resin were stirred until they dissolved. The resulting mixture was a heavy, tacky unguent carrying the sharp, woody scent of pine needles and damp bark. The cedar resin not only thickened the oil into a paste, but also possessed natural astringent properties that subtly altered the acidity of the body. The method of application required a simple physical tool: raw, unspun wool. Before wool was carded and spun into thread for weaving, it existed in soft, cloudy tufts, still heavy with the natural lanolin of the sheep. A woman would take a small, dense lock of this unspun fleece and press it into the warm mixture of oil and cedar resin. The fibers would absorb the sticky unguent, becoming heavy and saturated. This saturated wool was then inserted deep into the body, acting as a physical plug, a soft, fibrous barrier seated against the cervix, while the resinous oil provided a chemical one. It was a quiet, private routine, performed in the dim, flickering light of a Roman bedchamber. The little terracotta oil lamps would cast long shadows against the plastered walls as the woman prepared the wool. Because the low-grade olive oil could smell somewhat rancid and the cedar resin was sharp, wealthier women would often blend finer aromatics into the mixture. Frankincense and myrrh, imported at great expense from the Arabian Peninsula, were sometimes ground into fine powders and stirred into the warming oil. These precious resins dissolved slowly, releasing their rich, earthy perfumes. The myrrh brought a warm, slightly bitter scent, while the frankincense added a bright, almost citrus note to the heavy pine of the cedar. These additions masked the smell of the raw, aged oil, filling the small sleeping quarters with the scent of temple incense. It was a practical chemistry, passed down in clinical texts and quiet conversations, relying on the heavy press of old olives, the sticky sap of evergreens, and the soft, lanolin-rich fibers of the flock to grant women a measure of control in the dark of the night. Beyond the soft botanical remedies of wool and scented oil, there was a quiet reliance on the earth's heavier, more unforgiving elements. In ancient China, and stretching across the trade routes to the Mediterranean, the search for control often led women to the dense, cold weight of metals. Unlike the sticky plant resins or the gentle barrier of a sea sponge, these methods required the ingestion of substances that the body could not easily wash away or forget. It was a practice rooted in the belief that the firm, unchanging nature of metal could somehow halt the fertile, shifting cycles of the flesh. In the sprawling imperial households and quiet domestic quarters of China, concubines and wives alike might seek out small, carefully measured doses of liquid mercury or lead. These heavy elements were often suspended in a carrier liquid, perhaps a warm oil or a bitter steeped tea. The preparation was slow and methodical. A serving woman might warm the solution over a low charcoal brazier, stirring it gently until the silver beads of metal were dispersed through the dark liquid, before offering it in a small porcelain cup. It went down heavy, carrying a strange metallic slickness that coated the back of the throat and settled like a stone in the stomach. There was a profound, quiet cost to this internal chemistry. These heavy metals did not simply pass through the digestive tract, they stayed, settling deep into the tissues and the marrow of the bones. Over months and years of occasional use, a slow, creeping lethargy would take hold. The vibrant, warm flush of health would gradually fade, leaving the skin a pale, fragile white, almost like fine rice paper. Hair might thin, losing its luster, and a dull, persistent ache would become a familiar companion in the joints. This physical decline was rarely viewed as a sudden poisoning. Instead, it was experienced as a gradual, accepted dimming of vitality, endured silently as the necessary price of preventing another mouth to feed or another dangerous labor. Thousands of miles away, in the bustling, sun-baked cities of the ancient Mediterranean, a different sort of metallic remedy was gathered from the local forge. The blacksmith shop was a place of intense, radiating heat, ringing hammers, and the sharp, dry smell of ozone, hot dust, and burning coal. When a smith finished hammering a piece of iron into shape, he would plunge the glowing metal into a deep wooden trough of water to temper it. The iron would hiss and spit violently, sending up thick plumes of steam, leaving the water cloudy with flakes of dark scale, ash, and the microscopic detritus of the forge. Women would visit these forges in the quiet hours of the morning, carrying small, unglazed clay jugs to collect the cooling water. The practice was grounded in a kind of sympathetic logic long woven into ancient medicine. Iron was sterile, hard, and unyielding, and the water that repeatedly quenched its fire was thought to absorb those barren properties. Back in the shade of a courtyard or a small kitchen, a woman would boil this forge water to drink. It tasted exactly as one might expect, of wet rust, charcoal, and bitter, scorched earth. Some physicians of the era, observing this long-standing folk practice, recorded it in their medical texts with clinical detachment, noting simply that women who drank the blacksmith's water regularly would indeed cease to bear children.
They were correct, though not entirely for the reasons they believed. The water in the tempering trough was heavily steeped in iron, lead, and various industrial impurities, creating a toxic brew that slowly shut down the body's natural reproductive cycles. Yet, women returned to the forge with their jugs month after month, year after year. There was no widespread panic about the toxicity of the water, no moral outcry recorded in the town squares. It was simply a household routine, managed quietly among the women of a neighborhood, discussed in hushed tones while washing clothes or grinding grain. Maintaining the size of a family, ensuring there was enough wheat in the storehouse and enough space on the sleeping mats, required a deeply pragmatic approach to the body. The slow, creeping accumulation of lead in the blood, or the dull, heavy ache of iron water in the stomach, were carefully weighed against the very real, immediate dangers of childbirth and the crushing burden of poverty. It was a quiet, internal arithmetic, calculated in the shadows of the forge and the warmth of the tea house, where the heavy, unyielding elements of the earth were swallowed down in the hopes of a quiet, empty womb. As the centuries turned and the vast libraries of antiquity were scattered or sealed away in monastic vaults, the knowledge of preventing life shifted away from the heavy, unyielding metals and the formal scrolls of physicians. It moved outward into the damp, fertile soil of the medieval kitchen garden. The meticulous botanical treatises of the Greeks and Romans did not disappear entirely, but for the common woman of the Middle Ages, this knowledge was no longer something to be read in a physician's text. It became an oral inheritance, a quiet taxonomy passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, spoken in the hushed, familiar spaces where women worked side by side. These gardens were practical, enclosed spaces, often bordered by low stone walls or woven wattle fencing to keep out wandering livestock and the cold bite of the wind. Alongside the cabbages, the onions, and the beans that kept a family fed through the long winter, there were careful patches of other, more potent greenery. Here grew pennyroyal, with its low, creeping stems and its strong, minty fragrance that could clear a clouded head. Nearby stood rue, its blue-green, spoon-shaped leaves carrying a heavy, almost metallic bitterness. And tansy, tall and feathery, with tight, bright yellow button flowers that would bloom late in the summer. Tending these beds was a daily, unremarkable chore. Yet it required an intimate familiarity with the soil and the seasons. The women who weeded and watered these plots carried the evidence of their work on their skin. The sharp, camphor-like scent of tansy and the biting, acrid oil of rue would linger on their hands and beneath their fingernails long after they had returned to the hearth. It was a familiar herbal perfume that permeated the rough wool of their sleeves. A quiet testament to the pharmacy they cultivated just beyond the kitchen door. They knew exactly how much water the pennyroyal needed to thrive in a shaded corner, and they understood how the rue responded to the harsh midday sun. The true power of these plants lay not just in their cultivation, but in the precise, careful timing of their harvest. This was not a matter of simply pulling leaves from stems whenever a need arose. The women watched the plants closely as the days lengthened, waiting for a very specific window of time. The leaves had to be gathered just before the plants began to flower. This was the fleeting moment when the plant's energy was drawn up from the roots, concentrating the volatile essential oils in the foliage before they could be spent on the blossoms. Harvesting too early meant a weak, ineffective brew, while waiting until the flowers opened meant the bitter oils had already begun to dissipate into the warm summer air. Once gathered, the stems were tied together with rough twine into small, dense bundles. They were carried inside the dim, soot-stained interiors of the thatched cottages, away from the dampness of the morning dew. Here, they were hung upside down from the low, heavy wooden rafters. In the shadows of the ceiling, suspended above the constant, low-burning hearth fire, the herbs were left to dry. Over the weeks, the heat and the wood smoke would draw the remaining moisture from the leaves, turning them brittle and papery to the touch. The smoke of the fire preserved the herbs, blending the sharp medicinal oils of the pennyroyal and rue with the deep, comforting scent of burning oak or peat. When winter came and the garden outside was locked beneath a layer of frost, these dry, gray-green bundles would remain hanging overhead. They were simply part of the domestic architecture, quietly waiting among the braided garlic and the salted meats. When a woman needed to bring on her delayed menses, she had only to reach up into the smoky rafters, crumble a handful of the crisp, bitter leaves into a clay cup, and steep them in boiling water, relying on the quiet garden she had tended all year. Beyond the drying herbs in the rafters, there was another layer of prevention, one where the physical properties of plants blended seamlessly into the quiet logic of sympathetic magic. In the ancient and medieval mind, there was little distinction between a tea that provoked the body and an object that influenced it through mere proximity. If a certain root could halt conception when chewed, it stood to reason that its essence might also work when worn close to the skin. This was a world heavily governed by invisible sympathies, where the qualities of one thing could be transferred to another simply by touch, by intent, or by being bound tightly in the dark. The principle was straightforward. To prevent fertility, one might borrow the properties of something inherently barren. The mule, being a sterile hybrid of a horse and a donkey, was a powerful and readily available symbol of this barrenness. Medical texts and folk traditions alike suggested that a woman could borrow this sterility for herself. It was not uncommon to procure a small piece of a mule's uterus, or perhaps a fragment of its hide. These pieces would be carefully dried, perhaps salted and left in a cool, dark place until they were stiff and odorless, ready to be transformed into a wearable ward against unwanted pregnancy. Other amulets relied on different animal associations. The bones of a weasel were frequently used, drawing on old, deeply rooted folklore that associated the small, quick animal with peculiar reproductive traits. According to certain ancient beliefs, weasels conceived through the ear and gave birth through the mouth, making them a creature that defied the natural order of generation. A woman might seek out the tiny, brittle bones of a weasel's foot, bringing these objects back to her hearth to prepare them for use alongside the seeds of a barren willow tree. The creation of the amulet was a quiet, meticulous chore, often done by candlelight after the household had gone to sleep. A woman would take a small scrap of soft leather, perhaps offcuts from a cobbler or a piece of softened sheepskin, and fold it over upon itself. Using an awl and a thick bone or iron needle, she would pierce the tough hide, drawing a sturdy linen thread through the holes. The stitching was done slowly, methodically, creating a small, durable pouch just large enough to hold a few dried leaves, a sliver of mule tissue, or the fragile joint of a weasel. Once the pouch was filled and sewn shut, it had to be worn correctly to ensure its efficacy. The charm was typically bound to the body using a length of rough-spun wool, dyed red or left in its natural earthy tone. A woman would tie it tightly around her waist, letting the small leather pouch rest against her lower abdomen, or she would bind it around her upper thigh, just beneath the heavy hem of her linen shift. The knot was pulled taut, securing the object directly against the warmth of her skin. Throughout the day, as she moved through her chores, carrying water, tending the hearth fire, sweeping the hard-packed dirt floors, the pouch remained in place. The rough wool cord provided a constant, slight friction, while the leather pouch offered a steady, comforting pressure against her thigh or waist. It was a tactile reminder of the ward she had placed upon herself. In an era when the internal workings of the body were a mystery of drifting humors and hidden vessels, this physical object served as an anchor. At night, lying in the dark under heavy wool blankets, the presence of the amulet was a source of profound psychological reassurance. The fear of another mouth to feed, or the physical toll of yet another difficult confinement, was a heavy burden to carry into the marriage bed. The quiet magic of the leather pouch, holding the barrenness of the mule or the strangeness of the weasel, acted as a silent guardian. It allowed a woman to close her eyes and rest, trusting that the charm bound tightly to her skin would hold the unpredictability of her own body at bay until the morning. While the magic of amulets offered a gentle peace of mind, other women sought a more physical barrier against the possibility of a child, turning to the natural materials that washed up on the shores or grew in the shallow, sunlit waters of the sea. Along the rocky coasts of the Mediterranean, where the water runs clear and warm, local divers had long harvested natural sea sponges. Pulled from the uneven seabed, these fibrous, living structures were brought to the surface, heavy and dripping with salt water, to be washed and left out on the hot coastal rocks to dry. Once fully dried and cured by the sun, the stiff, brown masses were traded inland. They found their way into bustling apothecaries and quiet village markets, where they would be purchased for all manner of household cleaning, bathing, and personal washing. For a woman looking to prevent a pregnancy, a large sponge would be carefully cut down using a sharp paring knife. She would carve out a small, rounded sphere, perhaps the size of a walnut or a small plum, shaping the edges so that it would fit comfortably and securely within the hidden spaces of her own body. The texture of a natural sea sponge is uniquely suited to this purpose. When dry, it is rough, scratchy, and unyielding, but the moment it absorbs moisture, it transforms entirely. It becomes incredibly soft, pliable, and porous, capable of being pressed flat or rolled tight between the fingers, expanding naturally only when it needs to fill a hollow space. Before it was used, the sponge required a quiet preparation. It was rarely utilized dry. Instead, it was soaked in an acidic liquid, a method that reveals a long-standing practical understanding of how to make the womb inhospitable. On a small wooden washstand beside the bed, a woman might keep a shallow earthenware bowl. Into this bowl, she would pour a measure of strong, sharp vinegar, perhaps diluted with a little water from a pitcher, or the freshly squeezed juice of a lemon. The small carved sponge would be dropped into the liquid, where it would quickly drink up the acid, swelling and softening heavily against the smooth ceramic curve of the bowl. This preparation carried a distinct, lingering scent, weaving itself quietly into the ordinary smells of the bedchamber. There was the sharp, clean bite of the citrus, or the sour, fermented tang of the vinegar, cutting through the heavy, still air of a closed room. Beneath that bright acidity remained the faint, unmistakable brine of the sea, a deep, earthy saltiness permanently trapped within the fibers of the sponge itself. It was a smell of quiet intention, a nightly routine as ordinary as brushing out one's hair or snuffing the wick of a tallow candle. placed deep inside the body before sleep, the sponge acted as both a physical wall and a chemical deterrent, holding the acidic liquid exactly where it was needed to neutralize the seed before it could take hold. The great usefulness of the sponge lay not only in its simple effectiveness, but in its ability to be used again and again. When the morning came and the pale light began to filter through the wooden shutters, the woman would retrieve the sponge. She would carry it to her wash basin, rinsing it thoroughly in cool, clean water. The water would squeeze easily from its thousands of pores, washing away the remnants of the night, the acidic juices, and the lingering sea salt. She would wring it out gently within her closed fist, feeling the fibers press tightly together before setting it to rest on the stone ledge of a windowsill. There, in the pale morning light and the moving air, the sponge would slowly dry out. It would gradually harden once more, returning to a stiff, dormant little sphere. It sat quietly among the other small, everyday objects of a woman's life. A wooden comb, a bit of tied ribbon, a small jar of soothing salve, hiding perfectly in plain sight. It was merely a piece of sea life and a bit of kitchen fruit, completely unremarkable to anyone who did not know its true purpose, waiting patiently to be softened again when the evening returned. While women quietly maintained these botanical and acidic defenses, another method was slowly emerging in the private chambers of Europe, one that shifted the physical barrier to the man. This was the early sheath, a delicate and labor-intensive object crafted from the discarded tissues of the butcher's yard. Artisans, or sometimes the household servants themselves, would take the blind gut of a sheep or the pale, buoyant air bladder of a fish, beginning a long and unglamorous process of refinement. The raw tissue was first soaked in alkaline lye, a harsh, soapy solution made from wood ashes and water, which slowly stripped away the fat and muscle. This washing was not a brief task. The membrane had to be soaked, scraped gently with the dull edge of a blade, and washed again in a repetitive, rhythmic cycle. Over many hours, the thick and opaque tissue would gradually transform. It grew thinner with each scraping, eventually becoming a fine, translucent film, remarkably strong but soft to the touch. Once the harsh scent of the lye was rinsed away with clean water, the membrane was often rubbed with bran to smooth any remaining roughness, leaving behind a pale, weightless sleeve that felt somewhat like a second skin, though it still carried a faint, earthy trace of its origins. For those who found the animal membranes unpleasant, or simply too difficult to procure, there was an alternative made from the weaver's loom. Small, carefully measured sheaths were cut from the finest woven linen. Because dry linen would chafe and offer little protection, The cloth had to be treated before it could be worn. In the warmth of a kitchen or a quiet hearth, a small bowl of liquid beeswax or sweet almond oil would be heated until it was entirely fluid. The linen sheath was submerged into the warm liquid, absorbing the wax or oil into every thread. When it was pulled from the bowl and allowed to cool slightly, the fabric became heavy, supple, and beautifully pliant, its tiny woven gaps sealed tight by the golden wax. Securing these sheaths, whether made of oiled linen or sheep gut, required a certain deliberate care. They did not stretch or cling on their own. Instead, they were fitted with a slender silk ribbon, threaded through a hem at the open end, or simply tied around the base. In the quiet shadows of a Renaissance bedchamber, with the heavy velvet curtains drawn and only the low, flickering light of a single tallow candle illuminating the room, the tying of this ribbon was a delicate and precise task. The silk had to be pulled tight enough to hold the sheath firmly in place, but not so tight as to cut off circulation, requiring a slow, practiced knot in the quiet of the night. These items were considerable investments. The fine linen, the sweet almond oil, the silk ribbon, and the sheer labor required to scrape a sheep's intestine into a translucent veil meant that a sheath was a luxury, entirely out of reach for the common laborer. Because of their expense, they were never simply discarded after a single use. They belonged to the careful economy of the household, demanding their own quiet routine of maintenance. After the bedchamber grew quiet, or perhaps in the early light of the following morning, the sheath was carefully taken away to be washed. It was rinsed thoroughly in a basin of warm water, sometimes with a gentle soap or a splash of milk to maintain its softness. To dry properly without shrinking or losing its shape, the damp sheath was drawn over a smooth, rounded wooden block, specially carved for this exact purpose. It sat on its wooden mold near the hearth, drying slowly in the ambient heat of the room. Once it was completely dry, and perhaps dusted with a little fine powder to keep it from sticking to itself, it was gently folded. It was then tucked away into a small wooden casket or a velvet-lined drawer, resting quietly alongside silver buckles, signet rings, and other costly private possessions. While European gentlemen were tucking their costly sheaths into velvet-lined drawers, a vast ocean away, an entirely different botanical landscape was being navigated. When European settlers arrived in the Americas, they brought their familiar seeds and dried herbs, their pennyroyal, their rue, their Queen Anne's lace, carefully packed in wooden chests and wrapped in oiled cloth to survive the damp sea voyage. But upon landing, they found themselves in a dense, humid world of unfamiliar roots, vines, and foliage. The traditional apothecary's shelf was about to expand, heavily influenced by the deep, established knowledge of indigenous peoples who had lived alongside these plants for countless generations. In the expanding fields of the American South, the cotton plant was cultivated primarily for the white, fluffy bolls that would eventually feed the booming textile mills. Yet those who worked the heavy, dark soil knew that the plant held other properties hidden beneath the earth. The root of the cotton plant, specifically its thick inner bark, was harvested for a very different purpose. Women would dig around the base of the stalk, scraping the dirt away to expose the thickest roots. Using a small, sharp knife, they would peel back the rough outer layer to reveal the pale, fibrous bark beneath. It smelled faintly of raw earth and green sap as it was pulled away in long strips. This bark was then gathered and brought back to the hearth. It was dropped into heavy iron pots filled with water and suspended over an open fire. As the water reached a rolling boil, the pale bark would begin to steep, turning the liquid a deep, murky amber. The boiling process was slow and deliberate, reducing the water down until it became a strong, concentrated decoction. The resulting tea was dark and fiercely astringent, leaving a dry, puckering sensation on the tongue and the roof of the mouth. The smoke from the wood fire would mingle with the sharp, earthy steam rising from the pot, a scent that meant nothing to a passing observer, but carried a very specific meaning to the women who tended the fire. Further south, in the thick, heavy heat of the tropical Americas, different plants offered different solutions. The papaya tree, with its broad, deeply lobed leaves and heavy, sweet fruit, provided a remedy that was remarkably accessible. When a ripe papaya was cut open, its hollow center revealed dozens of small, wet, black seeds encased in a slippery membrane. Rather than being discarded with the rind, these seeds were scooped out with a wooden spoon and spread across a flat woven mat or a simple wooden board. They were left in the open air, drying slowly in the hot sun until their gelatinous outer coating shriveled away. Once the moisture had completely evaporated, the seeds shrank and hardened, looking and feeling very much like whole black peppercorns. They were chewed daily. When crushed between the teeth, the dried seeds released a sharp, peppery, and deeply bitter flavor that lingered in the mouth long after they were swallowed. Interestingly, this was a practice utilized by both men and women. In the thick heat of the tropical afternoon, a handful of these bitter seeds could be consumed easily as a daily preventative, a routine as mundane as drinking a cup of water or sweeping out the doorway. This knowledge of barks and seeds did not often find its way into the leather-bound medical journals of the era. Instead, it moved through informal, domestic channels. It was the language of the courtyard and the wash house. It was shared in the margins of the day, moving quietly from one household to the next. Recipes and remedies were traded slowly across weathered wooden fences, or spoken of in hushed, rhythmic tones, while hands were busy with communal chores, plucking chickens, washing heavy linens in a stream, or shelling peas into a tin bucket. A woman who knew exactly how long to boil the cotton root might pass that instruction to a neighbor who was struggling to feed the children she already had. They traded this knowledge in the exact same manner they traded seeds for the kitchen garden. A slip of a root, a handful of dried berries, a quiet word of instruction on how to brew it, how much to drink, and how bitter it would taste. It was an invisible, localized network of botanical medicine, sustained by necessity and passed down in calm murmurs through the generations. At the center of this quiet exchange of knowledge sat the mortar and the pestle. This was not a specialized medical instrument kept separate from the daily rhythms of the household, but a heavy, commonplace tool that lived permanently on the kitchen table or the hearth. It was often carved from a dense, unforgiving wood or chiseled from coarse stone, its interior bowl worn perfectly smooth by decades of friction. It was the vessel where the mundane met the medicinal, where grain was ground for bread in the morning, and where dried leaves, hardened resins, and brittle roots were reduced to powder in the evening. When the long labor of the day finally began to slow, and the children were settled into their beds, the house would grow quiet. In this late evening stillness, the repetitive rhythm of the mortar and pestle often provided a soft, steady percussion to close out the day. The sound of stones scraping against stone or heavy wood thudding against wood was a familiar, comforting echo in the dim light. It was a slow, deliberate physical effort. The pestle would bear down on the hard ridges of dried seeds, crushing them into fragments, then grinding those fragments into a fine, pale dust. The chalky resistance of dried crocodile dung, the stubborn fibers of cotton root bark, or the brittle snap of dried pomegranate rind all required the same patient circular motion. As the pestle worked, the air in the small kitchen would fill with layered, earthy scents. The sharp, minty fragrance of crushed pennyroyal leaves would rise from the stone bowl, mingling with the bitter, dusty smell of dried rue or the faint, sweet edge of wild carrot seeds. Sometimes the grinding released the heavy, metallic odor of mineral compounds, or the pungent tang of animal products that had been left to dry in the sun for weeks. The woman working the pestle would pause occasionally, using a calloused thumb to push the coarse bits back down into the center of the bowl, ensuring nothing was wasted, before resuming the steady, rhythmic grinding. Once the material was ground sufficiently fine, it was time to brew the infusion. The powder was carefully swept from the mortar with the side of a hand or a small wooden spoon, falling into an earthen cup or a small metal pot. Boiling water, ladled from an iron kettle hanging over the fire, was poured over the dust. The water would darken almost instantly, turning a cloudy brown or a deep, murky green as the plant matter released its oils and compounds. The cup was then set on the warm hearthstone to steep. There it would sit as the flames in the fireplace slowly collapsed into glowing orange embers and finally faded into a soft, powdery gray ash. The woman would wait in the quiet of the house for the liquid to cool enough to drink. When it was ready, she would lift the cup and swallow the bitter, earthen draught in a few steady gulps, ignoring the harsh taste that coated her tongue. This was simply another chore of domestic survival, an unbroken continuity of quiet labor stretching across centuries and continents. Managing the spacing of her children, protecting her own health, and maintaining the fragile economic balance of her household were tasks woven seamlessly into the late-night routine, no different than soaking beans for the next day's pottage or banking the fire for the morning. When the cup was empty, it was rinsed or simply left on the table for the morning sun. The heavy stone mortar was wiped clean with a damp cloth, its smooth interior waiting for whatever the next day would require. The house would fall entirely silent, save for the shifting of the cooling ashes in the hearth and the slow, deep breathing of the sleeping family. The night would stretch out, calm and undisturbed, settling heavily over the quiet corners of the kitchen, the dried bundles hanging from the rafters, and the heavy stone resting in the dark.